Welcome to Episode 4 of Unburden with Bourbon, the podcast where we focus on America's native spirit, bourbon. My name is Simon Provan. Thank you so much for joining me once again for another episode of the still fairly new podcast. I know in the beginning I had hoped this to be a weekly podcast, but with all the responsibilities that I have, right now that's just not possible. But I still want to thank you for your patience as these new episodes slowly come out. In this episode, I'm going to discuss 11 terms in the bourbon world that I hope you at least appreciate and perhaps find a little bit fascinating. So hey, you've waited long enough for episode 4. Let's cut to the chase and talk about those 11 terms here on Unburden with Bourbon. You know, I do have to admit to you that the main reason I have time to record episode 4 this week is I had a breakthrough case of COVID, which, by the way, is a great tongue twister to get warmed up with. A breakthrough case of COVID, a breakthrough case of COVID, a breakthrough case of COVID. Go ahead, try to repeat that. Seriously, go ahead, I'll wait. Oh, no, actually, I'm not going to wait. I want to get into these 11 terms that we're going to talk about today. But yeah, I've been fully vaxxed since April, and I'm telling you, I am glad I got the vaccination because things would have been far worse. The first few days, I was knocked out. I was fatigued. I can't imagine what COVID would have been like without that vaccination. But nevertheless, I am definitely on the mend and very happy to be on the mend. Been isolating in my basement, which is where I'm recording this, and thankfully everybody else in my family has tested negative and is completely healthy. Now, as much as I love bourbon, there is a myth out there that having alcohol in your system will help kill a cold, and I know some of you may have evidence of your own out there that it does work, but everything I've read actually says it will only lengthen the time because that alcohol in the system basically just goes into your blood. So I did not have any bourbon this whole time that I've been sick, but I will tell you I'm going to have some very soon. So speaking of bourbon, 11 terms that some of these you probably do know, some of these you may not know. In fact, I did hit on a couple of these during my previous episodes, but they're still important to know. And the very first bourbon term to know is bourbon itself. I actually think I may have covered this in every episode, but I can't get enough of this for the fact that there is actually a congressional act that recognizes bourbon as a distinctive product of the United States. So, to repeat, bourbon must be made of a grain mixture that is at least 51% corn. Bourbon must be distilled to no more than 160 proof, or 80% alcohol by volume, also known as ABV. Bourbon must be aged in new charred oak barrels. It may not be introduced to the barrel at higher than 125 proof. So there's certain proof levels that distillers have to check in with to make sure that they are actually producing bourbon. And the minimum that a bourbon can be bottled at is 80 proof. So you will find bourbon that is no lower than 80 proof sitting on a shelf in any type of store. If you do and it's labeled bourbon, it actually is not legally bourbon. Last couple of things. If an age is stated on the label, it must be the age of the youngest whiskey in the bottle. So most of the bourbon you're drinking does come from various barrels. So you can't take let's say a 12-year bourbon and mix it with a 2-year bourbon and call it a 12-year bourbon. It is actually a 2-year bourbon at that point. And of course, the biggest one, only whiskey produced in the United States can be called bourbon. Now, some distilleries try to wiggle their way around some of this. For example, Angel's Envy, which I know a lot of people like, it's finished in port wine barrels. So technically, it's no longer bourbon. At this point, once it goes into those port wine casks, it is whiskey. Not technically bourbon anymore. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't go out and buy this. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying you can't enjoy Angel's Envy, because a lot of people do. All I'm saying is that the way they get around this, they do what a lot of distilleries do. They put on the label bourbon finished in port wine casks. So they are being honest about it and at least letting you know what the process is. But the key word there is finished. I promise you I am not being a snob about this. In fact, my wife and I had a trip planned to Louisville right before COVID hit, and of course got canceled because of COVID. Angel's Envy was one of those distilleries we were definitely going to stop at, and when we can get back to that trip at some point, you can be sure Angel's Envy will be a stop for us. So please, no legal ramifications here. I am just telling you what the requirements are for bourbon. All of that being said, let's move on to our second term that I'd like to talk about, and that is the term straight bourbon. Now, I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on this as I did with what is bourbon, because basically the first part of this is you have to follow everything that makes bourbon bourbon. But what makes it straight bourbon is that it's aging in that charred oak barrel for at least 2 years. So 2 years is the key. If it's aged less than 4 years, by the way, it must have an age statement on the bottle. But most distillers, they want to put an age on there if it is over 4 years because many people see that as a type of premium bourbon. Another interesting note about straight bourbon, you can mix straight bourbon with other straight bourbon from the same distiller and still call it straight bourbon. What you can't do is mix straight bourbon with perhaps a regular bourbon and then still call it straight bourbon. Not allowed. So key there is 2 years aged in that charred oak barrel, minimum 2 years, and not mixed with any other type of bourbon unless it's straight bourbon. Now, I do want to take a quick pause here and actually give you a bonus term. Sometimes you'll see straight bourbons that have a state designation on them. For example, you'll see a lot of Kentucky straight bourbon. J. Henry & Sons in Wisconsin has a Wisconsin straight bourbon. So there is a little bit of difference from straight bourbon and a straight bourbon that has a state designation. So the way it earns that state designation is that it must be fully produced and aged in that specific state. So some bourbons are distilled elsewhere, then they're put in a barrel and shipped off to a different distillery where it will age there. This could still be considered straight bourbon, but it cannot have a specific state designation. All right, so now moving on officially to our third term, and kind of a bonus in here. We've got two terms that mean the same thing. There is barrel proof and cask strength. Again, two different terms, but they mean the exact same thing. Now, to help what these terms and actually the next few mean, I'm just going to quote what some of the experts have to say about it. And by the way, I did get all of these quotes from gearpatrol.com and some great articles that they have on bourbon. So first we hear from Charlie Downs, the artisanal distiller at the Evan Williams Bourbon Experience. Him talking about barrel proof and cask strength. He says, when it says barrel proof on the label, that means the bourbon was bottled at the actual proof that an aged bourbon was barreled at. It's not cut down with water. We take it, filter it, make sure to clean all the char out of it, and they will actually bottle it at that proof. As whiskey ages in barrels through the years, 10, 12, 14 years, you lose part of it through evaporation, and actually we'll talk about that in a little bit. And when evaporation happens, your proof in the barrel can go up, sometimes as high as 150 proof. Some people like a higher proof bourbon, like myself, so that's why we barrel it at barrel proof or barrel strength bourbon. Then you have your other aged bourbons, your 80 proof, 90 proof, 94 proof. They will take the bourbon that comes out of the barrel and they'll reduce it with distilled water to cut it down to whatever proof we want to bottle it at. So simply, barrel proof / cask strength is pulling the bourbon out of the barrel and not doing anything else with it whatsoever. All right, let's move on to term number 4, small batch. This is perhaps one of the more, I don't want to say controversial, but misunderstood terms of bourbon, mainly because there is actually no definition to what small batch is. But let's take some quotes. Again, these from gearpatrol.com, quoting first John Ray, the chief operating officer at Four Roses. This is what Mr. Reyes says. The definition of small batch is very vague. It basically means whatever the distillery that it comes from says it means. There's no set-in-stone definition. From our perspective, when they first put Four Roses small batch together, they took 17 barrels. They put together a formula, and it required 17 barrels of the 4 different Four Roses bourbons mash bills in the correct proportions. So that's what we mean when we say small batch. Now, honestly, does that mean every time we produce this, we only dump 17 barrels? No, but every time we dump barrels, it will be in increments of 17. So we keep the same formula every time. Now, Hunter Davis, a tour guide at the Jim Beam Distillery, had this to say. While there is no legal definition, general industry standard is around 150 barrels or less. What that means is we're really choosy about what goes into that batch. It delivers a more premium experience for the consumer. So small batch, a very loose term, but certainly it does play into the idea of being a more premium bourbon experience, as Hunter Davis had said at the Jim Beam Distillery. Now we move to term number 5, and this one is what it says it is. Single barrel. So going back once again to Hunter Davis, the tour guide at the Jim Beam American Stillhouse, he had this to say. Single barrel is small batch to the extreme. It is a batch of one single barrel. What this means is that our tasters have gone into the warehouse for a product like Knob Creek Single Barrel, and they're going to taste many different barrels and pick out a couple that they think are truly exceptional, that really highlight something fantastic about that product. They bottle it one bottle at a time, and therefore each bottle is going to be a little bit different, whereas small batch would taste the same each and every time. Now, frankly, some people do get confused with single barrel and barrel proof. They are not the same thing. In fact, BourbonGuide.com has a great explanation about this. It says, some single barrel products are released at barrel strength. Jack Daniel's has one, and most of the Four Roses single barrel private picks are barrel proof. But most single barrel bourbons are not released at barrel strength. Just think of Blanton's at 93 proof, Jim Beam single barrel at 95 proof, Evan Williams single barrel at 86 proof, and on and on and on. Let's just keep it simple and say that a single barrel bourbon does not have to be barreled at barrel proof. Now, you may be asking yourself, why not just bottle single barrel at barrel proof? And BourbonGuide.com once again says, for the same reasons distilleries dilute all their other products. They either think it tastes best at that proof, or they can make more money at that proof. More than likely, it's a combination of the two. It tastes good at 90 or 100 proof, and they can get more bottles out of the barrel that way. There may even be some tax incentives to bottle it in non-barrel strength. I can assure you whiskey dilution makes a huge difference in the taste of the final product, and companies that are trying to put out premium product do not undertake it lightly. So a great answer to a great question. Now, for me, these are my words. An easy way to remember this is that just like all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon, all barrel-proof bourbons are single-barrel bourbons, but not all single-barrel bourbons are barrel-proof. Either way, let's move on to term number 6. It is a term that was unpopular in the 70s and 80s and started to make a comeback in the 90s, but it's been around since the late 1800s, and that is bottled in bond. Now, as I said, this term has been around since the late 1800s, and there's a whole history I could go into, but I do try to limit these shows to a time frame that I know people will stay with me. So let's cut to the chase. Basically, what was going on is that Kentucky distillers were selling their products to people in Chicago, and what the people in Chicago would do is buy the cheaper spirit, usually vodka, and because the vodka was still in a barrel, it was very easy for these Chicago establishments to tamper with what was in that barrel. So they would buy the cheaper vodka, and then they would throw all kinds of stuff into that vodka to make it taste like a whiskey profile. And the things I'm talking about are things like caramel coloring, glycerin, wood chips, even sometimes formaldehyde. By the way, getting this information from wineenthusiast.com. So basically, they were poisoning vodka to make it taste like whiskey. So the Kentucky distillers got together and they really pressed the federal government on this. And the solution then was for the federal government to come up with a standardized designation called bottled in bond. So basically, again, as wineenthusiast.com says, this was basically one of the earliest examples of a consumer protection law. So what does bottled in bond actually mean? Well, it's a designation that mandates that brands clear numerous, rigorous hurdles. The spirit must be aged for at least 4 years and bottled at precisely 100 proof. Another part of this is that the bourbon must be made by one distiller at a single distillery in one season and then aged in a bonded warehouse. According to, again, this article in wineenthusiast.com, it says that as a distiller, it's the holy grail, the hardest and most constrained thing to make. It reflects what many distillers believe to be the best criteria for excellence in whiskey, and the criteria has been unchanged from 1897. So I mentioned that in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s, bottled in bond was an unnecessary thing to chase after because people during that time really preferred lesser proof whiskeys, so there was no need to try to make a bourbon that was bottled at 100 proof. But fast forward to the mid-90s, Jim Beam reintroduced bottled in bond. It really took off, and a lot of distilleries have followed since then, going after that very rigorous bottled in bond label. All right, moving on to number 7. So 7, 8, and 9 are all going to relate with each other. And by the way, I'm going to go back now to some of this information coming from GearPatrol.com. So first, we are talking about the mash bill. This may be something that you hear often and just don't know what it is. Well, pretty simple. A mash bill is basically the list of ingredients that is used to make bourbon. So again, all bourbon must contain at least 51% corn. That is a standard all distilleries have to follow. But the other 49% can vary depending on distiller. Most bourbons, of course, have a mix of the corn, the wheat, the rye, and barley. But now there are some distilleries trying out other grains, including that Q one that I never know how to say. Quino, Quano. I know, I could look it up, but I'll admit to you that I'm being a bit lazy about this. I just want to take you through these terms. All right, so the mash bill, again, basically just the recipe that each distiller uses to make their bourbon. Now, term number 8 is a term you may see on many bourbon bottles. This is sour mash. So what exactly is sour mash? So you have the ingredients all mashed together to make that bourbon, and usually what distilleries are going to do is take some of that used mash and put it in the new mash. In fact, this is very similar to using a sourdough starter for bread. So this does give the mash a slightly sour aroma, but like GearPatrol.com says, it doesn't affect the flavor of the finished whiskey. Now, there's really 2 reasons that distilleries use a sour mash. One, it makes the taste of the whiskey more consistent from batch to batch. And 2, it lowers the batch's pH, which basically means that the fermentation process is much more efficient. Now, of course, there is another added bonus to using sour mash, and that is when the backset or the spent mash, the used mash, is added to the next fermentation, the possibility of there being bacterial infestations are greatly reduced. So just another reason why this has been the preferred method of most distillers since the mid-1800s. Side note here too, there's no reason to be impressed when a bourbon is advertised as sour mash bourbon. And yes, I'm doing air quotes. Again, because almost every single bourbon out there uses sour mash. Now, on the other hand, there are only a few bourbons that use what is our 9th term, sweet mash. Now, as sour mash mixes in previously spent mash with its new mash, sweet mash is all new. In fact, it helps to make bourbons a bit sweeter when you're using sweet mash, which that's partially where it gets its name from. So what happens is using sweet mash leads to a higher pH and produces flavors you won't find in those traditional sour mash bourbons. Now, there are a couple of examples I came across. One of those is Castle and Key. They currently only offer gin and vodka, but don't be fooled, they do have a sweet mash bourbon. The thing is, that bourbon is currently aging in charred oak barrels down at Castle and Key, and of course is yet to be offered to the public because it's not ready to be offered to the public. Now that said, there is a very well-known, or at least very celebrated sweet mash bourbon that is produced by Wilderness Trail. There's actually a great article in Forbes written by Fred Minnick in which he discusses how much he likes this bourbon and how Wilderness Trail uses sweet mash without having to worry about bacterial infestations. So I certainly need to get my hand on a bottle of this stuff and try it for myself. But even before you do that, check out that article. You can Google it. Just type in Forbes, Fred Minnick, Wilderness Trail, and I'm sure that article will pop up. Very interesting read. Okay, 2 more to go, and these last 2 are probably my favorite ones to talk about simply because I find the terminology so colorful. So number 10 on our list is White Dog. Now, to show that I'm fair and I'm not biased against a certain distillery, most of the information that I got to talk about White Dog comes from the Angel's Envy Distillery website. So let me read this to you. White Dog goes by a few different names: White Lightning, Light Whiskey, White Whiskey. No matter what you call it, though, it's the basis for all American whiskey. As it comes off the still, all whiskey is essentially White Dog. Now, my own words here, this is not moonshine, and really for one reason, because it gets taxed. White Dog that is sold in stores gets taxed. Moonshine, legally, or illegally, I guess you could say, is that whiskey that is distilled in the hills of wherever and is not taxed at all. So that's the difference between White Dog or White Lightning or light whiskey and moonshine. So just to make that clear. Now, White Dog is sold in stores, and essentially what it is, it's an unaged raw whiskey that isn't required to spend any time aging before it's bottled. Again, this coming from the Angel's Envy website. While water is usually added to dilute the alcohol content, because let me tell you, it is very strong, it spends no time aging and absorbing flavor from barrels. So if you've ever tasted White Lightning, then you know exactly what the value of barrel aging brings to whiskey. You know those old cliches like, you can't truly know what happiness is unless you have some sadness, or there can't be darkness without light. Well, I recommend all you bourbon drinkers out there, if you haven't tried White Dog, go ahead and try it, because it'll make you appreciate your bourbon that much more. All right, our 11th and final term for episode 4, Angel Share. I actually find the term angel share and the whole concept of what it is, well, beautiful, if I'm going to be honest with you. The first time I heard this term was when my wife and I took a tour of J. Henry & Sons in south central Wisconsin. It was explained to us that as bourbon ages, some of that spirit will evaporate from the barrel and into the atmosphere, or if you will, the heavens, and the evaporated bourbon then is considered a sacrifice to the angels, assuring the angels get their share of what's in the barrel. So again, I just find that concept pretty neat. In fact, though, when you look at the top of a barrel house, you'll see what looks like black mold, but it's not black mold. Those are the remnants of that evaporated spirit. So angel share isn't just with bourbon. It's basically that any spirit that ages in a barrel, you're going to have some evaporation. So any spirit that ages in a barrel is going to have some of that angel share. Now, interestingly enough, during Prohibition, a roof with seemingly black mold on top was a good indication to federal troops that there was illegal alcohol being stored on the premises. So you could say that the angels perhaps felt they weren't getting enough of a share, and the angel share became the outlaw's weakness. Very clever, right? Okay, maybe not. Either way, that does bring us to the end of episode 4. Thank you so much for spending the last 25 minutes with me on this episode. It is a pleasure and honor knowing I have at least 2 listeners out there that do look forward to these episodes. By the way, if this is your first time listening in, please make sure to check out the first 3 episodes wherever you listen to podcasts. Unburden with Bourbon can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Facebook, and a number of other places. And speaking of Facebook, how about you find us on Facebook and give us a like? We certainly would appreciate it. And of course, by we, I mean me, Simon Provan, your host. All joking aside, I do want you to know I genuinely appreciate your support and listenership of Unburden with Bourbon. Thank you so much. And as I say goodbye, my friends, I do want you to remind you to please enjoy your bourbon responsibly. Do not drink and drive. After all, if you do, you may end up becoming more than just a burden on way too many people. Instead, find a place where you can sit down with friends and family, enjoy your stories, enjoy your bourbon. In other words, find a safe place where you can unburden with bourbon.